Holiday horrors hold a special place for me because of how they mix the innocence and joy of Christmas within the bloody gore of a slasher movie. It's a Wonderful Knife. It's obviously a play on words and the theme of the highly regarded Capra film. Now, I missed it in theaters, but it's now available on Shudder. So let's see if this can ring a bell and cut off an angel's wings. After saving her town from a psychotic killer, Winnie Carruthers' life is less than wonderful. When she wishes she'd never been born, she finds herself in a nightmare parallel universe where without her, things could be much, much worse. So this is exactly what you think it is. A reimagining of the Frank Capra holiday favorite, except this time, a crazed masked murderer is running amok in the quaint town. Winnie is our protagonist, and she becomes the hero of the story very early on. And then, because she hasn't been able to move on and move past the killings that were taking place, and she doesn't receive support from anybody around her, she's done with life. And so she makes a wish, causing her to wake up to a world where she was never born. No one knows who she is, and a killer is still attacking in their town. Now, because this is a rehashing of It's a Wonderful Life, the trajectory for the plot, it's not only very familiar, but it's wildly predictable and obvious. But that in itself, it doesn't hurt the storytelling. The narrative works to weave in both suspense and humor, to create an off-kilter balance of emotions that can enhance both efficiently. Now, I like how in the alternate version of Winnie's world, the coloring is changed to these cool blues and grays with a lot of shadowing, casting a detached and frozen emotionless tone to the narrative. The brightly colored real world, it's a nice contrast to illustrate that without our hero, the world is just a cold and lonely place. Now, some of the score is outstanding, using holiday music that sounds a ton like Trans-Siberian Orchestra, and I think that's awesome because it just adds some good energy and even urgency to some scenes with those driving rock guitars and really thick drums. Now, in minor roles within the movie, we have Joel McHale and Justin Long. McHale is fine. I mean, he's actually not being his typical cynical persona, and instead being kind of a cheesy holiday-loving dad, which I thought was nice. Now, Justin Long, though, he steals his scenes because of the ridiculousness of his character. He's got this veneers and then a southern-like accent that comes across like a small-town Zorg from The Fifth Element. Now, I realized this almost immediately, and then I couldn't unsee it, which I kind of worked for the film. Now, I'm not sure why the character decisions were made, but for me, they just added enough absurdity to be enjoyable. Now, surprisingly, there's a fair amount of melancholy in this story. Now, I know the original is filled with that, and it's one of the prevailing emotions, but this being a horror comedy, I didn't expect to have the amount that we get. This is mainly shown through all of the characters who have just completely moved on from the tragedy of the previous year, except Winnie, leaving her to grieve and try to cope all by herself. And she does get sympathy from her aunt, which I think can include some witty humor, but the isolation that Winnie feels, it's necessary to begin the impetus for her wish that then she'd never been born. And while this is technically a slasher, it really is pretty tame in how much carnage we actually see play out. There are some nice kills, especially when they're creative, like there's this one with a candy cane. But more often than not, there might be a bit of struggle, and then a knife goes into somebody and they die. There's minimal blood spurt, and not much in the way of gore, especially when put into the context of other modern slashers. Now, there is a slight sci-fi bend that comes around towards the end of the story, and it feels out of place, and it's introduced just out of the blue without any reasoning or logic, and it just was an odd inclusion because it made no sense. Now, I think where this movie suffers the most is the exact same way that It's a Wonderful Life suffers. We're not given enough time with the protagonist to make her a sympathetic character. In the scenes we get with her, Winnie is grumpy and abrasive, so when she's instantly poofed into the alternate reality where nobody knows her and she wasn't born into the town, it's difficult to even care whether she lives, dies, or learns any sort of lesson. I mean, at least the film can be self-aware enough, though, that it is a slasher version of It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, right down to verbal acknowledgement that Winnie is George Bailey and her friend Bernie is Clarence. Now, I was hopeful that this would contain similar fun like some of the other genre mashup movies, kind of like Happy Death Day, Freaky, even the recent Totally Killer. That's not what we really get. There are some enjoyable moments that either use clever wit to create chuckles or employ some energetic kills that are kinda gory, but the overwhelming tone of this is just cringy and lackluster. So overall, It's a Wonderful Knife has fun with its premise, but fumbles the execution by not fully leaning into the slasher genre, nor embracing the comedy it so wants to provide. The characters are rushed into the story, leaving them shallow strangers with no emotional investment to be concerned about their outcome. This is a film of almosts. It's almost gruesomely gory, it's almost smartly witty, and it's almost enjoyable. Where it does nail the presentation is in the ties and nods to It's a Wonderful Life. That's not enough, though, to make this a worthwhile watch. There's no sex or nudity, a lot of profanity, and a bunch of violence. I give It's a Wonderful Knife 2.5 out of 5 couches. So what are some of your go-to holiday movies? I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me. So this is a good knife. This is, well, it's an okay knife. This, it's an adequate knife. This, it's decent. But this, it's a wonderful knife.